Title: The Grandmother's Gambit, A Web of Lies. Unraveled in Judge Judy's court. The air in the television studio was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the fiery human drama about to ignite. Under the unflinching gaze of the cameras and the millions of unseen viewers at home, a family was preparing to tear itself apart. The iconic voice of the announcer sliced through the tense silence, laying out a battle that felt both deeply personal and shockingly common. 24-year-old Craig Bird Jr. and his mother, Julie, are suing Craig's grandmother, Ninfa Islas, for an unpaid loan and stolen property. With those words, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just a broken financial promise, but the shattered fragments of trust between a grandmother, her daughter, and her grandson. The bailiff called the case, and the plaintiffs, Craig Bird Jr. and his mother Julie, stepped forward, their postures rigid with a mixture of hope and simmering anger. Across from them stood the family matriarch, the grandmother, Ninfa Islas, her expression a carefully constructed mask of defiance that barely concealed the storm of emotions brewing beneath. Judge Judy, a figure of unwavering authority, peered over her bench, her eyes missing nothing. She began with the foundational facts, her voice crisp and clear. "Mr. Bird, this is your grandmother?" The young man, Craig Bird Jr., nodded, his voice respectful but firm. "Yes, ma'am." The judge's gaze shifted. "And this is your mother?" Again he affirmed, "Yes." It was a simple establishing of relationships, but everyone in the room could feel the weight of those bonds, the sacred trust between a grandparent and a grandchild, now stretched to its breaking point. Judge Judy went straight to the heart of the matter. "Which one of you loaned her the money for the car?" Young Craig Bird Jr. didn't hesitate. "I did, Your Honor." He stood a little taller, the weight of his claim settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just a grandson. He was a creditor, a young man who had gambled his savings on a family promise. Judge Judy meticulously laid out his claim for the record. "And it is your claim that you loaned your grandmother this money so that she could purchase a car or assist in purchasing a car for her son." The statement hung in the air, a simple allegation with complex roots. "Now, when did you loan her the money?" Craig Bird Jr. was precise, the date etched into his memory like a scar. "On June 8, 2015, Your Honor." That specific date, June 8, 2015, was more than just a point on a calendar. It was the day his faith in his family was put to the ultimate test, the day a seemingly simple act of generosity would spiral into years of resentment and legal action. The judge, a master investigator, knew the devil was in the details. "Tell me the circumstances surrounding you loaning her the money." She wanted the story, the whole story from the very beginning. Craig Bird Jr. took a breath, and the courtroom seemed to fade away as he transported them back to that fateful day. "Well, the initial agreement was, I loaned her the money for her to get her son a vehicle, and she would repay me after she sold her houses. And that never happened." His words were laced with the bitterness of a promise broken, a future payment that had turned into a ghost. Judge Judy was a cartographer of truth, mapping the conversation's every contour. "Where were you when you had this conversation?" she probed. "In Colorado, on the phone," Craig replied, painting a picture of distance, a conversation separated by miles but bound by blood. "Did she call you or did you call her?" This was a critical detail. Who was the architect of this deal? Who had reached out across those miles to ask for a significant sum? "She called me," Craig stated, a simple fact that carried immense implications. It was the grandmother, Ninfa Islas, who had initiated the transaction. She was the one who had picked up the phone and set this entire chain of events into motion. Then came the moment of pure, unvarnished truth. Judge Judy leaned forward, her instruction leaving no room for paraphrasing or interpretation. "Tell me exactly what she said." Craig Bird Jr. dug deep, summoning the ghost of that conversation from years past. He began to channel his grandmother's voice, replaying the pivotal exchange that had led him to part with his money. She said, "Grandson, can you loan Adrian $2,100 to get a vehicle?" The use of the name Adrian introduced a new character into the drama, the son of the grandmother, the intended beneficiary of this loan. Craig's own response echoed his initial caution, the natural wariness of a young man faced with a large financial request. I said, I don't know. That's a lot of money. He was hesitant, unsure, his protective instincts kicking in. But then, his grandmother, Ninfa Islas, presented the lure, the irresistible hook that sealed the deal. She said, I'll repay you when I get my houses, when I sell my houses. My houses, you know. I'm putting them to go for sale on the market. This was the cornerstone of the agreement, the collateral that wasn't property on paper, but a promise based on impending wealth. It was a vision of easy money, a soon-to-be-resolved debt that made the risk seem minimal. Judge Judy pounced on the timeline. Did she say when she was putting them up for sale? Craig's answer was confident, bolstered by what he believed was certain knowledge. No, but they were present time. Present time. They were already there for sale, so I knew that they... He didn't even need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. The houses were already on the market. The sale was imminent. The repayment was just around the corner. It wasn't a vague promise for some distant, uncertain future. It was a short-term loan against a sure thing. Judge Judy summarized the core of the contract, the promise that now lay in ruins. So she said, I'll pay you for the loan when I sell my houses? Yes, ma'am, Craig affirmed, the two words heavy with the weight of betrayal. Then came the pivotal question, the one that would determine the entire direction of the case. Has she sold her houses? Judge Judy asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer. Yes, Craig replied, and that single word was a dagger. The condition for repayment had been met. The houses were sold. The money had changed hands, just not his money. The follow-up question was almost a formality, but it needed to be asked. Did she pay any part of it when she sold the houses? No, ma'am, Craig said, and the finality in his voice was palpable. The promise was not just broken. It was obliterated. The foundation of the agreement had crumbled to dust. It was then that the grandmother, Ninfa Islas, could no longer remain silent. The mask of quiet defiance slipped, and she interjected with a denial that was as blunt as it was dismissive. Because I don't owe him any money. The air crackled with the directness of her contradiction. She wasn't arguing about timelines or interpretations. She was denying the very existence of the debt. Judge Judy, however, was not about to let her off with a simple denial. She began to drill down into the mechanics of the transaction. No, did he hand the money to you? She asked Ninfa Islas. No, ma'am, the grandmother admitted. This was a crucial point. The money had never physically touched her hands. So, Judge Judy turned back to the young plaintiff. Who did you hand the money to? Craig's answer filled in a vital piece of the puzzle, explaining the geographical complication. I handed it to her son because he was in Colorado with me. She was in Texas selling her houses. A picture was forming of a multi-state arrangement, a financial handoff facilitated by family connections. A glimmer of understanding flashed in Judge Judy's eyes. Now I understand, Mr. Bird. Now I got it. She had pieced together the logistics. But she was far from finished with the grandmother. She turned her formidable attention back to Ninfa Islas, her question a direct challenge to the woman's blanket denial. You never called him? The grandmother stood by her story. No, ma'am. She was claiming the entire phone conversation, the very heart of the plaintiff's case, had never happened. It was his word against hers, a classic he said she said, but Judge Judy was a human lie detector, and her next words were a thunderclap of disbelief. I don't believe that. The statement was absolute. He didn't make up that story. He didn't make up that story that you called him and said, could you lend Adrian money to buy a car and I'll pay you back when I sell the houses? He didn't make up that story. With that, Judge Judy made her position clear. She found the young man's testimony credible and the grandmother's denial utterly lacking in truth. The elaborate, specific nature of the story, the amount, the purpose, the collateral of the houses, rang true to her practiced ear. Her focus then shifted to the missing link, the ghost at the feast. Where is Adrian now? Do you know? she asked Ninfa Islas. The grandmother's answer was evasive, devoid of any useful information. "No, ma'am," Judge Judy pressed, her voice dripping with sarcastic implication. "In the wind." It was a phrase that perfectly captured the elusive nature of the man who had driven off with the $20,100 and seemingly vanished from responsibility. She asked Craig the same question, reinforcing the point that the beneficiary of this loan was nowhere to be found. "Where's Adrian now?" "I don't know," Craig replied, underscoring the futility of trying to recover the money from the person who had actually spent it. With the key witness and recipient of the funds missing, the responsibility fell back onto the shoulders of the woman who had, according to the credible testimony, guaranteed the loan. Judge Judy then returned to the established undisputed fact. "Did you sell any of the houses that you had up for sale?" she asked Ninfa Islas. There was no denying this tangible reality. "Yes, ma'am," the grandmother was forced to concede. She had reaped the financial windfall from the sale of her properties, yet the debt she had promised to pay from that very source remained outstanding. The evidence was overwhelming, the credibility decided. Judge Judy rendered her verdict with swift, unambiguous finality. "Good. $2,100, that's for you on the car." She was awarding the full amount to the plaintiff, Craig Bird Jr. His relief was visible, a slight slump of the shoulders as the tension of the long-standing dispute finally began to drain away. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, the gratitude evident in his voice. But the case was not entirely over. Judge Judy, having dispensed with the main event, turned her attention to the lingering subplots. "Now, there's lots of other little issues here that I don't know whether we want to get into." She glanced at the paperwork, a hint of impatience in her demeanor. The grandmother had filed a countersuit, likely a desperate attempt to shift blame or recast herself as the victim. Judge Judy's assessment of it was brutal and succinct. "You have a ridiculous countersuit which I probably won't even entertain." With that, she dismissed any notion that the grandmother had a legitimate claim against her grandson. Finally, she addressed what was likely a claim for emotional distress. Her rejection of it was delivered with her signature dry wit, a moment of levity in an otherwise tense proceeding. "And I'm not entertaining your complaint for emotional distress, 'cause the only one that's usually emotionally distressed after a day here is me." The line drew laughter from the audience, a release of the built-up pressure, but it also served as a final, definitive dismissal of the grandmother's defensive tactics. The gavel came down, symbolically severing the financial tie that had bound this family in conflict. But the emotional scars, laid bare for all to see, would undoubtedly take much longer to heal. Lesson for the listeners and viewers. This case serves as a stark and painful reminder that mixing family and finances is a dangerous game, one that often ends with broken relationships and broken trust. The promise of family should never be a substitute for a written contract, especially when significant sums of money are involved. A grandmother's word, which should be a bond of honor, became a point of contention, forcing a grandson to take her to court to be made whole. The missing Adrian, the vanished son, highlights the perils of being a middleman or lending money to a third party based on someone else's promise. Always get the terms in writing, no matter how close you are. Blood may be thicker than water, but without clear agreements, it can become muddied with resentment and legal battles that leave everyone, even the winner, with a feeling of loss. Let this be a lesson to never let a loved one's promise become your financial problem.